Hello, everybody, and welcome to this review of Chapter 3, The Study of Collapse, in Joseph Tainter's 1988 book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, by Cambridge University Press. Before we get into Chapter 3 in depth, I thought it useful to review these 4 points that Tainter outlines at the beginning of the 4th chapter in Understanding Collapse. Here he says that there are 4 critical points to why civilizations collapse. First, human societies are, if anything else, problem-solving organizations for the members of that society. So a culture evolves to a particular environment and must respond to changes in that environment in order to keep sustaining the individual people that comprise that society. The second point is that socio-political systems do require energy for their maintenance and for them to continue. Energy in the form of food to feed its people, and energy in the form of, in the modern world, electricity, but in the past, firewood or coal or other forms of energy for cooking and for basic daily needs. The third point is increased complexity carries with it increased cost per capita. That means that each person that's a part of that culture or of that society has increasing responsibilities to contribute to that society. That could be in the form of social obligations or family obligations. It could be in the form of increased taxes or increased expenses. For farming communities, it could be in the form of higher expectations for food production, well beyond what is necessary for just for the needs of that farming family. But farmers may be expected to pay tribute or taxes to the elite class or a ruling figure, or as gifts to the gods, depending on religious connotations. The fourth point is an investment in socio complexity as a problem-solving response will often reach a point of declining marginal returns. And this becomes a key point throughout the entire book that Tainter really does provide examples for. As a society expands and grows in population, its economy becomes increasingly more complex. Typically what happens is the more of these increased costs that the individual person has to put in to sustain the society, the larger the expectations on that person, that individual, the less they get out of their effort or their labor or their taxes or the money that they are spending on a wide range of services and goods or of supplies or of food. So to summarize, and this summarizes the whole book very well, as a society becomes increasingly more complicated, the returns to the person, the individual citizen of that culture, decline, even though they're putting more and more effort and energy into maintaining the status quo. At the outset of Chapter 3, Tainter asks the question, why do civilizations collapse? And he offers 3 examples: the Western Roman Empire from Europe, the Mauryan Empire from India, and the Zhou dynasty in China. When these complex civilizations collapsed or declined, he says of the population that preceded these collapses, quote, quite often the fall of such early empires acquires for later peoples the status of a paradise lost, a golden age of good government, wise rule, harmony, and peace, when all was right with the world. And he goes on to say that the attempt to understand the loss of paradise is at the same time a grasping to comprehend current conditions and a philosophy of how a political society should be. And here we attempt the impossible, which is to summarize the rise and fall of the Roman Empire in just a couple of minutes on this slide. On April 21st in 753 BC, legend has it that the city of Rome was founded by Romulus and Remus, the wolf twins. In 509 BC, the Roman Republic was formed, and citizens of the state were given voting rights. In 45 BC, a dictatorship was formed, and the government changed from a democracy to a dictatorship. In AD 80, the Roman Colosseum was built and the games began. And this was a phenomenon that was to spread throughout the empire as the popularity of gladiator games increased. In part, this was a political strategy, and we see an escalation of the games, and in particular, the violence of the games, to distract the public from other problems afflicting the empire as a whole. The political strategy as the Colosseum began to increase in its influence in public life was called bread and circus. Feed them bread and give them circus. Food and entertainment was used as a way to deflect from ever-increasing problems with the economy and with their expansionist philosophy in terms of maintaining the wealth of the elite ruling class and the political class of the empire. By AD 117, the geographical territory of Rome had reached its greatest extent. And by AD 122, Hadrian's Wall was built to keep the barbarians from Scotland out of the southern half of the British Islands or the Roman Empire. By AD 376, there were continued invasions by the Goths from the north of the city of Rome and from the Roman Empire. And from that point, Rome was plagued by a series of crises, not to mention the continued irritation of the so-called barbarians or Celtic people, the Goths and Visigoths to the north, who continued to plague the empire. Political control fluctuated during these periods, and there were periods of stability, but also periods of great instability. We see a lot of assassinations of the emperors and of political infighting and of attempts to recreate what they foresaw as a golden age of the empire itself. Attempts to replicate these types of environments in which Rome was seen as at its greatest cultural power. In AD 395, Rome was divided into East and Western empires. In AD 410, the Visigoths sacked the city of Rome, and in 476, the last emperor of Rome was deposed. There are over 210 different theories for the collapse of Rome, and so it has featured prominently in history and in social theory and in the Western civilization that we have today. If we were to summarize the many theories for the collapse of Rome, some of these would likely be contributing factors that featured prominently in the reasons for its decline. Climate change always features highly, particularly when it is related to food production or agricultural production. But shifts in the climate can alter the amount of food and the ability of farmers to produce enough food for growing populations. Failure to adapt to environmental challenges such as climate change or other external factors, the failure to adapt to these challenges prevents society to live harmoniously within its environment. So in general, if a society is overexploiting the land or agricultural productivity is declining, or say they are harvesting at a much higher rate than the land can sustain, then ultimately that form of economy is going to run into problems of deficiency, deficient resources, and ultimately inability to provide energy and resources for its society. The commodification of agricultural yields contributed to this decline. by generating wealth and attributing wealth to agricultural produce, not so much the farmers, but the land-owning elite commodified wheat and barley and the produce of the Roman farmers and turned it into a form of currency. Decreasing cereal pollen and increases in and decreases also in farm weeds appear in the pollen record as we go forward through time with the Roman Empire. Diminishing agricultural yields is a suggested result of decreasing cereal pollen in these climate proxy records. We also interestingly see an increase in forest pollen as well. So when agricultural crops are shown to be decreasing in, say, pond cores and other environmental proxy records, and we see an increase in woodlands, that suggests that less and less land is being cultivated and that agricultural productivity is actually on the decline. Increasingly, in the latter half of the Roman Empire, as the Colosseum increased in popularity and the games increased in violence, the people were exposed to and desensitized to violence on a daily basis. The political philosophy of the ruling elite was to give them bread and give them circus. That is, fill their bellies with bread and distract their minds with circus or entertainment. And it doesn't hurt to add fermented bread or beer to that list of necessities. This, combined with an increasingly violent culture of gladiator and chariot games, and not just the Colosseum in Rome, but in Colosseum amphitheaters throughout the empire, the public was desensitized to violence. And this allowed for continued policies of expansion, territorial expansion, and of foreign conquest. That is, the games desensitized to the citizens to expansionist warfare. All of this masked underlying social and economic problems of the empire. So I ask you, have any of you been desensitized to violence in any way? And what are the broader social implications for such a policy? If by chance you need a refresher, I refer you to any number of YouTube clips for the opening scene of or the trailer to the original movie The Gladiator starring Russell Crowe. This is a good visual sense of what it could have looked like to Roman citizens or soldiers of the Roman Empire or gladiators at the time of its maximum cultural impact. The decline and ultimate collapse of the Roman Empire left Europe in a period of dark ages where the so-called barbarians or Celtic tribes from the north essentially began to rule in more localized and smaller regional systems of governance. There is a decline in urbanism. I wouldn't say necessarily that there was no urbanism, but certainly there was less than during the Roman Empire, and a decline in literacy of the general people to the point where only a very small, highly educated and elite, typically clergy, knew how to read and write Latin, and most people did not know how to read or write their native languages. A system of governance known as feudalism became the dominant political system, and we might refer this to some form of localization across Europe. And again, I refer you to the opening scene of The Gladiator with the battle between the Goths or the barbarians, the Germanic people to their north, and the Roman military in those opening scenes to set the stage for what was to come following the decline of this all-powerful empire. And I ask the question, was it better for the general population that the Roman Empire eventually collapsed, or was that worse? Was it essentially a paradise that was lost to them, a golden age or a utopia that no longer existed? Or I pose the question, was life better for the farming people or the working people of Europe and Southern Europe in particular, once those heavy tax burdens and military service obligations were relieved from their families following the collapse of the empire or of the state? Now we must ask, what is civilization collapse? And how does collapse differ from culture change? Because we know that cultures and societies do evolve and their practices change through time as they react to different challenges and stimuli. And some civilizations fluctuate between a very powerful ruling class and a not so powerful ruling class. For example, if we look at ancient Egypt and the Old Kingdom reverting to what we call today as an intermediate period, where the pharaoh loses power and prestige and cultural capital, and regional governors or even mayors or regional leaders increase in their authority. So is it always the case that when a civilization collapses, it is this apocalyptic, catastrophic event with massive amounts of lives lost and starvation and war? Or is it sometimes that it's a more gradual decline and what we might call a significant culture change instead? Do the people still have family rituals and religion? Are religious practices still practiced? Are farming communities still producing and providing for their families? Or is it just the state and the ruling class that seems to disappear? Certainly in some cases, a collapse of a state level society is a horrific and cataclysmic event for a population, but not all the time. And each collapse should be treated differently and analyzed within its own historical particular circumstances. Perhaps it's useful when we ask the question, what is civilization collapse, to compare that to decline, because some civilizations may have a very long and gradual decline before they cease to exist as we might recognize them. Some factors that go into civilization decline or the decline of state power is mismanagement by elite powers, those in charge, such as corruption, increasing corruption, or increasing gaps between the wealthy class and the poor, but overall a decrease in the ability of those in charge to solve the problems of the general population. This can lead to a disintegration of a political system. Now, even though the state and the ruling class may decline and ultimately collapse, many subcultures and regional cultures may continue to persist and actually thrive in some cases. As I mentioned, there are some symptoms that we can watch for in the archaeological record to predict when a civilization or a state is beginning to decline and when it may have completely collapsed. For example, we can ask the question, is there any evidence of mismanagement or of corruption? Is there evidence for a widening gap between the rich and the working poor, or in the numbers of the wealthy versus the numbers of the poor? Is there a large and prosperous middle class, or is there a very large gap in inequality? Also, we ask, do the ruling parties or political system have the ability, or do they suffer from the inability to resolve social problems that plague the people? This primarily could be concerned with a decline in food production and probably more aptly its distribution to the people. Is there evidence of interpersonal violence, of fraud between people, of theft between people? If these are increasing crimes among the populace, then it could be a sign that people's problems are not being met and they're seeking ways outside of the normal laws or cultural norms to feed their families or to rise above poverty. If reflecting back on our own society in the last 10 to 15 years, we see a number of demonstrations and protests and other large-scale public displays of discontent. Now, this has a long history in our civilization, and so it doesn't necessarily mean that we are on decline or on verge of collapse, but it is a symptom of the people expressing their discontent with the inability of their rulers to satisfy their problems. So in 2012, the Occupy Wall Street was an extended protest that went on for weeks, primarily against wealth inequality and primarily in New York City. This was a wide collection of people from various parts of society that didn't necessarily have a coherent single message to the government, but were generally discontent with the way things were in their cultures. 2 years later, there was a global protest in 2014 where people around the world came out in large numbers, including in New York City and in Europe, to protest the world power structure and the environmental degradation that they saw as the issue of climate change. They were calling for action and plans and strategies to curb the emissions of fossil fuels. So this international worldwide protest was better organized than Occupy Wall Street, and it took one of the main themes of Occupy Wall Street and focused on that issue alone, generating massive turnouts and representing their concern, particularly the younger generations, that they were inheriting a planet that was not well. In 2017 in New York City, a large protest was organized in opposition to the first presidency of Donald Trump. And this was the focus of their discontent, along with a lot of the other problems that were associated with the climate march and the Occupy Wall Street march. That is the increasing gap between the rich and the poor, or wealth inequality, and environmental concerns, among a range of other positions that put them in opposition to the election of Donald Trump. At the beginning of 2017, a large-scale protest was organized, particularly on the Capitol in DC, called the Women's March. This was designed around bringing attention to opposition of the government's policies concerning reproductive rights and abortion and gender equality and a range of other issues that resonated strongly with a large portion of the population. And this was one of the largest peaceful protests recorded. And it still resonates now, almost 10 years later, as the causes of their discontent and their ability to organize has fueled further political strategies and events to oppose restrictions on reproductive and women's rights. On the other side of the political spectrum in the United States, we saw the Capitol riot in Washington, D.C., which began as a peaceful protest but then turned violent. These were supporters of the Trump administration expressing their opposition to the results of an elected President Joe Biden on January 6th in 2021. All of these are symptoms that the population, no matter their political orientation, are discontent with the ruling elite and the ruling class and the structure of the state and, in general, the state of their economic ability to support their families and have a thriving and productive life. More recently, we can point to the No Kings protests, which are organized around these same themes primarily. This one from New York City on October 18th in 2025, just to emphasize that these protests are growing in size and in numbers, and that the people continue to be discontent now, 12 years or so later. We are in a series of decades where the people are expressing their constitutional right to turn out and march in protest. They have in this society the right to vote and the right to organize and to protest, and both are occurring as the society becomes increasingly divided into two different perspectives of political philosophy. So as we look back at the archaeological record and we look at the reason for collapse, there are several major themes that Tainter has identified. First, the depletion of vital resources for the people. And that can include environmental destruction, deforestation, or desertification, or the declining productivity of agricultural land that has been overused and overexploited. This can lead to food disruption and increasing prices, which makes it more and more difficult for people to feed their families and live a happy life. Some causes can be external or environmental only in nature, like insurmountable catastrophes. This could come from an external attack from a neighboring enemy or a disease pandemic that is especially harmful and virulent, or it could come from natural hazards like a volcano or an earthquake, although typically a society at the state level, especially if it has a large geographical base, can withstand a single natural hazard or disaster like a tsunami or an earthquake. But sometimes if there are other factors that are weakening the power structure of a state, then this could be the impetus to the beginning of a decline or a potential collapse. Other factors or themes that lead to the collapse in the past include insufficient political responses to crises, that is, the inability of the ruling class to make effective decisions to solve problems or to solve and resolve crises. For example, if there is a major earthquake or flood, if the ruling parties cannot agree on how to act or can't agree to move fast enough or are unable to move food around logistically in a way that helps the people that are in distress, then these can be factors for decline and collapse. Of course, external intruders or invasion is always a threat, and typically this may come towards the end of a civilization when they are already in decline and their neighbor may come in and overthrow their governing class. It could also come from an internal class conflict, like traditional Marx and Engels explanations of class warfare or welfare inequality, or conflicts between the haves and the have-nots. All in all, elite mismanagement is typically a contributing factor. If the power structure is unable to handle challenges and to resolve problems that the populations may be experiencing, then a decline is likely imminent or in progress. There could be social dysfunction, as I had mentioned earlier. This might mean a rise in crime like theft and especially fraud, but also we can't rule out increases in corruption by the ruling class or the ruling elite, where the rich get richer and the rules don't apply to the wealthy elite the same way that they would apply to the working or poor classes. So these could be economic factors for the decline of a state-level society. Looking back at the decline of the classic Maya civilization between AD 250 and certainly by 900 AD, this society was based on the ritual authority of a ruler, a priest king, more of a theocracy than anything, where the ruling priestly class, or the king, representing a powerful city-state, or the empire as a whole, was responsible for appeasing the gods in order to keep the rain falling and the corn production at high enough levels to feed everybody that was living in the cities at the time of the Yucatan Peninsula, modern day Guatemala highlands, and in this area around the Gulf of Mexico. The Maya were a culture that embraced and loved violence as much as the Roman Empire, and it experienced endemic warfare, much like some of the early states in Mesopotamia did. But among the Maya, it was a very unique situation that for some reason we are all very fascinated with exploring even today. But by 800 AD, we see a rise in warfare and a decline in the construction of monuments, in the construction of stelae and of temples, and we see this increase in violent ritualism and human sacrifice. The Maya were reliant on monoculture, primarily the crop maize, which was a major part of their religion. And in order to keep the rainfall coming and the crop production high, their priests believed that human sacrifice and bloodletting would appease the gods and resolve their agricultural issues. But declining food production and increasing environmental exhaustion of the land and deforestation were actually contributing to a reduction in rainfall and ultimately a decline in their ability to produce through agriculture. Ultimately, the people of the Maya state, the civilization, lost faith in their rulers and abandoned their cities. But I should point out that the Maya language is still spoken today by many thousands of people in Central America and in other parts of the world, including New York City. So there are probably more people speaking Maya today than there were in 250 AD. But we should take the Maya as a lesson in caution, not to ignore the environmental consequences of our agriculture production, and not to put all of our eggs in one basket and rely on a monoculture system of food economy. So while the Maya were successful in developing a rather extravagant and wonderful, colorful culture, it was also heavily into violence and warfare, almost using war as a form of artistic expression and human sacrifice. So the level of violence at the upper level of the political system was quite astounding and is in part what is so fascinating to us today. The ruling priests were able to organize labor on a massive scale, meaning that during the classic Maya, they had extraordinary cultural capital and the ability to mobilize many thousands of people in their vision of what human society should look like. In the end, resource depletion, environmental degradation plagued the ruling class and restricted agricultural output. We see this through environmental records like soil erosion from deforestation and land scarcity, finding productive agricultural land. By deforesting and growing crops intensively, land in these areas was depleted rapidly, causing the need to deforest further, and this practice of slash and burn agriculture ultimately caused a decline in rainfall and the ability for soils to hold its nutritional soils. So we have silting up of lakes and streams, and ultimately climate change combined with other problems like endemic warfare led to the end result of social abandonment, where people walked away from their cities and returned to what I would call more of a Neolithic style of farming and horticulture, where they no longer had the burden of heavy taxes, and the role of the ruling elite priestly class stopped this system of human sacrifice. So the violence in the war declined, and the burden on the everyday person declined. And ultimately, I would argue that following the collapse of the classic Maya, the general population may very well have been better off. Tainter's example from the American Southwest in some ways remains true today, but in other ways does not age very well given the modern theories of the Hohokam and others in the Southwest of the United States. It is true that agricultural productivity declined, but I wouldn't attribute it necessarily to mismanagement of the people, more to some of the other challenges that were faced by other civilizations where intensive agriculture can lead to soil depletion, especially when you begin using forms of irrigation. But climate change in this case is probably a paramount factor. The Hohokam, the Mogollon, and others in this area benefited from about 1,000 years of a change in climate that brought a little bit more rain and moisture to the system until it sort of ran its course and it reverted back to what is very dry and desert climate, making agriculture actually challenging on large intensive scale. So soil depletion, climate change, and cooler and drier conditions made it more and more difficult to produce food on the scale that it had before. And so we see the cultures change from villages and semi-cities that were built in the floodplains and the productive agricultural areas near streams and intermittent streams, which likely had more water in them, to moving into mountains and canyons and hiding their villages in more difficult to reach places such as Mesa Verde on the cliffs of more rugged terrain where people could hide their agricultural produce and protect it from marauders and invaders more effectively. These are changes that we see archaeologically that do represent challenges and struggles primarily driven by production of agricultural yields. So we see evidence of starvation, and some have argued that there's evidence of cannibalism out of desperation as people in some places faced pretty extreme famine. Ultimately, there was abandonment of the less productive areas and a different form of economy actually was developed. So can we really call this a collapse? I would say that the Puebloan people that emerge is more of a shift in regional cultures and economies from the ways it was practiced in the years prior with Hohokam and Mogollon. In ancient Egypt, the Old Kingdom, we learned several lessons from a civilization that developed in a rather unique geographic and environmentally contained environment of the Nile Valley. So agricultural productivity and yield is directly tied to the rains and the flooding of the Nile Valley, which brings with it the nutrients from upstream and deposits it on the agricultural fields on an annual basis in Upper and Lower Egypt. So by 2686 BC, we have the development of the Old Kingdom, which does represent, I would argue, the greatest period of political power and consolidation that the ancient Egyptian pharaoh ever enjoyed, with tremendous political capital and very early capacity to mobilize and inspire its population to construct massive pyramids on the Giza Plateau in honor of their pharaohs. It's important to note that these pyramids were tombs effectively and were meant to be sealed off. These were not even public spaces, and they took a generation to construct. So you can imagine the political power that the pharaoh had to convince people to at times abandon their fields and join the construction projects. And it is possible that these were designed as public works to keep farmers employed during periods of the flooding Nile when they had to essentially wait for the waters to recede at certain times of the year before they could go home and plant their crops. It would have been motivating to have a pint of beer and a bowl of food or cereal grain as a daily ration for workers who came down to the capital and helped in the construction of these pyramids. Ultimately, there was political decline towards the end of the Old Kingdom, and this is attributed to shifts in the Nile flood events, again, if we turn to the environmental proxy records. And that is dictated by precipitation levels in interior Africa, which feeds the Nile with the water that ultimately comes downstream. We should note that the Egyptian civilization rose and declined at least 4 times before ultimately exhausting itself in handing over power peacefully to Alexander the Great when he rode in, and the ushering in of the period of the Ptolemaic pharaohs, which governed the ancient empire from a Greek standpoint, ultimately declining and going out of existence towards the end of a very long, millennia's long ancient Egyptian civilization that is characterized by a lot of different changes and reinventions and persistence for several millennia. With the Harappan civilization along the Indus River, we have a very unique situation that is debated even still today between how the power was structured in what was obviously a state level society of a different type. There were capital cities like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, of course, and there were medium-sized villages and then smaller farming outlets. But beyond that, we see very little evidence of prestige, wealth, expression. We don't see evidence of a prosperous and wealthy ruling class or of even a priest king. Instead, their monumental architecture seemed to be centered on the construction of public facilities known as great baths. And their understanding and regulation of water as an important resource was critical to the flourishing of the Indus and the Harappan state. But in the end, deforestation plagued the civilization. As they cut down trees, we once again see soil erosion from agricultural fields with silt runoff into rivers. We actually see the disappearance of one major river, either due to tectonic activity or from deforestation and oversilting. Either way, as forests declined, we see a deterioration of the brick quality because they are using a lot of firewood to fire these clay bricks that they use to construct their cities, and as they had for millennia before. So with agricultural decrease in productivity and increasing problems associated with deforestation, we see a rapid decline in the Harappan state as people once again abandoned their cities and resorted to a period of localization where there was a loss of central authority and control and a reversion back to small-scale Neolithic style farming. It is possible, and we cannot rule out, that an endemic or virus played a role, perhaps malaria, but it does seem to be the exhaustion of the environment and an unsustainable consumption of different resources, including primarily firewood and arable land and agricultural soils, along with water, that led to the decline and ultimate collapse of the Indus civilization. In Mesopotamia, there are a series of ancient states, and we can look back to the earliest, the Sumerians, and analyze their rise and talk about their decline. Mesopotamia was an extraordinarily complex society. It's multicultural with many city-states, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers that was reliant on some of the first plant and animal domesticates that the world had ever seen. But towards the end, the Sumerians faced episodic political catastrophes that we see in the decline of other states such as Rome, and an inability of their ruling class to react to these challenges. They saw challenges with resource depletion, again, the salinization of their agricultural fields from centuries of irrigation and the planting of wheat and barley and cereal crops, which served the purpose of fixing salt in their fields. And without a proper crop rotation regime, they depleted those fields of important nutrients. So environmental degradation caused the decline of their agricultural productivity. This combined with an increasingly arid and desertified climate for the region with hotter and drier conditions, making agriculture increasingly more challenging to feed an ever-growing population. And from the beginning, Mesopotamia had the similar issue as the Maya with endemic warfare, where conflict between and among city-states and neighboring tribal groups was persistent. They walled their cities to protect their resources and their stored food from marauders and raiders. All of this resulted over time in a decline in living standards and ultimately collapse that was caused by the invasion of a neighboring state. Over and over, Tainter points to an insufficient political response as a primary reason for a collapse of a state. A civilization can face many, many challenges if its political ruling class is functioning properly, then it can mitigate these challenges and soften the blow that they may face. But if the political power structure is incapable of making decisions or is making poor decisions and may be affected by corruption or mismanagement, then this can lead to social dysfunction on a massive scale. And quoting Melikashvili, Tainter says the following: if social forms fail, it is because they have laws of their own whose purpose is other than making optimal use of their techno environments. Of course, there are some humorous explanations for the decline of states. One is predicted by Lawler, where he argues that, based on mathematical cycles, suggested that to some that the collapse of the United States would be predicted by the year 2040, and he made this prediction in 1970, which was the beginning of some economic problems like gas prices and other inflationary issues that plagued the United States in the 1970s and also in the early 1980s as well. There's no real basis for this hypothesis, but it is interesting how he uses his mathematical equations to predict the actual year for the decline of the United States. But ultimately, we can say that this is up to our elected public leaders and those of the social elite who pull the strings of our society. Can they solve the problems that plague the population? I'm not sure if Alfred Kroeber, the famous anthropologist's theorists on civilization and its decline, would fall under mystical factors, but he did write about, quote, higher cultural values and forms and social climaxes, referring to the golden age of, or the cycles that seem to appear in ancient history and how that might reflect upon our current civilization, the cycles of creativity in art and science and philosophy, that these material manifestations of high culture and golden eras can be seen through what's left of the material culture of these ancient civilizations and of what they wrote about and the state of their knowledge. Are these things, art, science, and philosophy, progressing and increasing in sophistication and in prevalence, or are they declining? Are we reverting back and looking for things to our past instead of creating things in our current present tense. I think the concept of looking back and being nostalgic for the past, if this is something that is on the increase, people are constantly looking backwards for music and art, movies, or are they looking for what's being created today in terms of what they prefer in entertainment and art or in science? These could be signs of social decline or signs that we have already reached our social maximum or golden era. That's not to say that a state cannot have multiple golden eras. I guess the control of that is also among our political and social elite to make good decisions. But a common pattern that Tainter points out is 1, centuries of rising development, followed by 2, a long period of repetition in terms of art and science and philosophy. Are you just repeating and publishing the same thing over and over again? Or 3, imitation of previous grandeur in art and music and culture. Are we constantly bringing back and recreating old movies? Or are we constantly creating sequels to a theme? Or are we inventing new creative outlets, brand new music and brand new forms of entertainment and art for our people? The same applies to a science as well. And if not, then we may be seeing the beginning of social and political decline in a state-level society. Again, we can look back archaeologically with the clarity of hindsight and identify these through the manifestation of artistic expression and their writings of science and of philosophy. Given these theoretical ideas that Tainter poses in looking back at ancient decline and collapse of civilizations, I ask you, the listener of this lecture, what are the indications of social decline or of culture change in Western civilization, beginning with the Greeks moving through Rome and to the modern era? And do you personally have concerns regarding civilization collapse? Do you see it as this apocalyptic scenario, perhaps with zombies roaming the earth and utter destruction of our infrastructure and massive loss of life through warfare and famine and disease? Or are you not so concerned with social decline and view our best days ahead of us? Perhaps a golden era of our civilization is right around the corner and will appear miraculously as a result of the work of this youngest generation? Or are we experiencing any kinds of the symptoms of decline that Tainter has pointed out? Can you recognize the symptoms of decline in the form of inflation and primarily in the form of a reduced return on your personal investment as a member of a citizen of the state? In this presentation, most of the images are from Google image searches and are used under the Creative Commons and educational use, copyright use framework. This has been a review of Chapter 3 for Joseph Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies, published by Cambridge University Press. Thank you for listening.